Anyone interested in swapping spouses? This one here is headstrong and far too self-reliant for her own benefit. My husband's words sliced through the balmy Georgia evening like a razor, and I observed as uncomfortable laughter spread across my sister's backyard. The aroma of smoking hickory and seared steaks lingered thick in the humid savannah atmosphere, but suddenly every taste had vanished from my mouth. I stood near the wooden table, clutching a bowl of homemade potato salad I had prepared from scratch that very morning, and felt the familiar ache of his remarks settle deep into my chest, like a thorn I had trained myself to overlook throughout our years together. My name is Marlena. I am 34 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have been married to Sterling, a man who once convinced me I was the center of his entire universe. Standing there at my sister Primrose's summer cookout, surrounded by relatives and acquaintances who shifted uneasily at his attempt at humor, I understood how distant we had grown from those initial vows we exchanged before the altar. Sterling positioned himself by the smoking grill, cold beer clutched in his grip. That recognizable smirk spread across his features like a costume he donned for social occasions. He was entertaining the crowd the way he consistently did at events such as this one. My achievements, my character, my entire being condensed into a cheap joke for hollow amusement from people who had no idea what transpired behind our locked doors. Seriously, no volunteers, he persisted, motioning in my direction with his bottle. She's obsessed with her career. She has thoughts on absolutely everything imaginable. And please don't even mention how she constantly believes she's the smartest person in any room. Honestly, gentlemen, I'm practically offering her at no cost. I sensed my sister's gaze upon me from the opposite end of the yard, filled with that combination of compassion and exasperation I had grown familiar with over the years we had spent together. Primrose had never warmed to Sterling, not since our initial Thanksgiving gathering when he made a dismissive remark about her decorating choices, but she had mastered the art of holding her tongue for my benefit and for domestic harmony. The remaining guests shuffled nervously, some providing weak chuckles that faded in their throats, others suddenly becoming fascinated with their plastic plates of baked beans. And then there was Callum. Callum resided 4 houses away from us on Willow Creek Lane, in a modest craftsman home with an immaculately maintained yard full of azaleas and magnolias. He was 37, unmarried, and had relocated to our neighborhood roughly 2 years prior, following his own marriage dissolution. He worked as a civil engineer at a company in the city center, and generally kept to himself, though he was perpetually courteous and warm when we encountered each other on the sidewalk, or retrieving mail in the early hours. He had received an invitation to the cookout through Primrose's husband, who played tennis with him on weekend mornings at the recreation center nearby. Callum placed his drink on the wrought iron table and gazed directly at Sterling with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. I would happily accept her. The statement suspended in the atmosphere like fog from the grill. Sterling's grin wavered for just an instant, a fracture in his meticulously constructed persona before he pushed out a laugh that rang hollow, even to my ears. Oh, you believe you could manage her? Believe me, friend. You have no clue what you're getting yourself into with this one. I believe I understand perfectly, Callum responded plainly. There was no ridicule in his tone, no playful undertone to soften the declaration he was making. He rotated to face me, and something in his unwavering hazel gaze caused my breath to catch unexpectedly in my throat. So, what hour should I arrive tomorrow evening? The backyard fell into absolute stillness. I could perceive the crickets chirping in the magnolia trees bordering the property, the distant rumble of a vehicle traveling on the road beyond the picket fence. My husband's complexion had turned ashen beneath his summer tan. The smirk had been entirely erased from his attractive features. He hadn't anticipated this outcome at all. He never anticipated anyone challenging his bluff, because nobody had ever possessed the nerve until this moment. Something transformed within me at that instant. It was subtle initially, like the first fracture appearing in a frozen pond before the spring warmth finally arrives. Years of suppressed words, ignored emotions, and quiet degradations suddenly surfaced all at once like champagne bubbles rising. I observed my husband, truly observed him for perhaps the initial time in years, and recognized a stranger who had invested our entire marriage eroding everything I represented. until I scarcely identified myself anymore in the reflection. Then I observed Callum standing there anticipating my response. 7:30, I stated. My voice was composed, unwavering, resolute. I failed to recognize it as my own, because it had been so long since I had heard myself speak with such determination about anything. I placed the bowl of potato salad on the wooden surface, smoothed the fabric of my summer dress with quivering hands, and proceeded toward the gate without glancing back at anyone. Behind me I perceived Sterling's voice rise in objection, heard my sister call my name with worry in her tone. But I continued walking. I proceeded down the gravel pathway, past the parked vehicles baking in the evening sunshine, and kept proceeding until I reached the corner where the ancient oak tree offered cool shade. My hands were trembling violently. My heart was hammering so forcefully I could sense it pulsing in my throat like a caged bird. But for the initial time in years, I also experienced something else entirely unexpected beneath the anxiety. I experienced liberation. I had no knowledge of what tomorrow would deliver. I had no knowledge of whether I had just committed the greatest error of my existence or the finest decision I had ever reached in my 34 years. But standing there on that peaceful street corner with the summer sun commencing its descent and the sounds of the cookout diminishing behind me into silence, I understood one thing with complete certainty. I was finished being the target of someone else's cruel mockery. That evening, I sat in the shadows of our living room, listening to the grandfather clock mark time on the wall, and contemplating how I had reached this juncture in my existence. Sterling hadn't returned yet from the gathering. I presumed he remained at the cookout, probably criticizing me to anyone who would listen, manipulating the narrative to position himself as the victim of an ungrateful and irrational wife. He excelled at that particular skill. He had always excelled at that. I encountered Sterling when I was 24 years old, recently graduated with a degree in communications and brimming with aspiration for the future that extended before me. I had just secured my initial legitimate position as a public relations coordinator at Meridian Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing corporation headquartered here in Savannah. He was an account manager at the identical company, magnetic and self-assured with a smile that caused me to feel like the sole person in any space we inhabited together. In the beginning, he honored my ambition and determination like it was something precious. He informed me he admired how enthusiastic I was about my profession, how I wasn't hesitant to voice my thoughts in conferences or defend my concepts when others resisted. When I earned my initial advancement after merely 16 months of dedicated effort, he escorted me to dinner at the finest establishment we could manage and announced to everyone within hearing distance that his girlfriend was destined for greatness in the world. I trusted him entirely when he declared we would construct our empire together, collaborators in every meaning of the term. But somewhere during the journey, the celebration transformed into rivalry between us, and subsequently the rivalry transformed into bitterness that contaminated everything we had constructed together. It commenced subtly, the manner these situations always do, so incrementally that I failed to notice the pattern developing until I was ensnared within it like an insect in resin. A remark here, a jest there, nothing that appeared substantial on its own when scrutinized individually. When I earned promotion to communications manager 2 years into the position, he made a crack about how I must have impressed the appropriate individuals in the appropriate ways to progress so rapidly. When I began working extended hours on a critical initiative that could define or destroy my professional path, he complained intensely that I valued my occupation more than our union and our future together. When I proposed we establish a budget to accumulate savings for a residence of our own, he charged me with being manipulative and fixated on finances, even though we were barely surviving on our combined earnings. The term headstrong became his preferred weapon against me in any disagreement. Every occasion I maintained my position on something significant to me. Every occasion I voiced a perspective that contrasted from his own. Every occasion I reached a determination without consulting him initially for his endorsement. I was being headstrong, excessively self-reliant for my own benefit, challenging to handle, impossible to satisfy, regardless of his efforts. He converted my strengths into deficiencies and caused me to feel remorseful for possessing them initially. I reflected on the countless social events where he had made comparable jokes at my expense. perpetually with that magnetic smile displayed so individuals believed he was merely being playful with his wife. The manner he would dramatically roll his eyes when I discussed my career, as though my profession was an annoyance to his existence, rather than something to take pride in. The subtle criticisms concealed as humor that left me doubting myself long after the visitors had departed for the evening. Was I excessively focused on my profession? Was I neglecting my husband? Was I genuinely as challenging as he portrayed me to everyone we knew? My mother had raised me to be resilient and self-sufficient after circumstances demanded it of her. After my father departed when I was 11 years old, walking out one afternoon to purchase groceries and never returning, she had worked 2 positions to keep our family financially stable. She instructed me that a woman should never rely entirely on anyone else for her survival or contentment, that I should construct my own foundation and stand independently regardless of what existence presented me. I had carried those teachings with me throughout my life, like protection against the world. Sterling had once professed to respect that about me beyond everything else. Now he despised it with every fiber of his existence. I recalled a conversation we had approximately 4 years into our marriage. Late one evening, following another dispute that had left us both depleted and vulnerable, I had been offered a director position at a competing organization, a considerable step up the corporate hierarchy, with a substantial increase that would have transformed everything for us. I was thrilled beyond expression, already strategizing in my mind how we could utilize the additional income to finally acquire that residence we had been discussing for years. But Sterling had responded with fury so severe it alarmed me that evening. He charged me with attempting to overshadow him before the entire world, of causing him to appear inadequate before his colleagues and acquaintances. He declared individuals would believe he couldn't support his family if his wife earned more income than him, that he would be publicly humiliated. He manipulated me into declining the offer with tears and accusations and days of frigid silence. And I had invested all the years since questioning what my existence might have resembled if I had accepted it instead of remaining. Sitting in that darkened living room with only the clock for companionship, I recognized how much of myself I had sacrificed on the altar of his delicate ego throughout the years. I had suppressed my own radiance so that he wouldn't feel endangered by the glow I naturally emanated. I had silenced my aspirations, filtered my perspectives, and diminished myself into a version of Marlena that was more acceptable to his insecurities and anxieties. And what had I received in exchange for all that sacrifice? A husband who offered to exchange me at a cookout like a used vehicle he was weary of maintaining. The entrance door crashed open around 11 that evening, startling me. Sterling stumbled inside, the smell of alcohol heavy on his breath, and activated the light switch by the entrance. He appeared surprised to discover me sitting there in the chair where I had been waiting for hours. "Oh, so you decided to return home," he declared, his voice saturated with sarcasm and disdain. "Considerate of you to humiliate me before everyone, and then simply vanish like that without explanation." I observed him. This man I had vowed to love for better or worse, and experienced nothing but profound exhaustion wash over me like a tide. "I'm exhausted, Sterling," I stated quietly. "I'm retiring to bed now. We're not finished discussing this," he shouted after me as I ascended the stairs slowly. But I was finished. I was so completely finished with all of it. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of Sterling slamming cabinet doors in the kitchen, with excessive force that reverberated through the residence. The sun was streaming through the bedroom curtains cheerfully, and for one blissful moment, I forgot about the cookout, the joke, the date I had consented to attend. Then it all came rushing back with perfect clarity, and my stomach constricted with a mixture of nervousness and something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. I discovered Sterling seated at the kitchen table when I descended, a cup of coffee before him that he wasn't consuming. His jaw was fixed in that rigid line that indicated he was preparing for confrontation, his knuckles pale around the ceramic mug he was clutching. I poured myself a cup from the pot and leaned against the counter, awaiting the tempest I knew was approaching. "You need to rectify this situation," he declared finally, still not looking at me directly. "Rectify what precisely?" "The humiliation you caused me yesterday at your sister's residence." He glanced up then, his eyes sharp with barely restrained fury. "You need to contact Callum immediately and inform him it was entirely a jest. Inform him you're not attending any date with him this evening, and then you need to apologize to me for making me appear like a complete fool before everyone we know." I placed my coffee cup down slowly, deliberately, purchasing myself time to select my words carefully. "You made yourself appear like a fool, Sterling. You stood before our family and acquaintances and offered to exchange me like I was some piece of furniture you were tired of possessing. That was your decision to make that joke, not mine. It was a jest." He slammed his palm on the table so forcefully the coffee cups rattled, and some liquid splashed over the rim onto the wood. Everyone present understood it was a jest, except you and that peculiar neighbor who apparently has an attraction to married women. If it was merely a jest, then why are you so disturbed that someone accepted your offer? He stared at me with disbelief, and I could observe the wheels turning in his mind as he attempted to formulate a response. Sterling was not accustomed to me resisting like this against him. Typically, following one of his outbursts, I would withdraw into silence, provide him space to settle down, and eventually smooth things over with an apology, even when I had done nothing wrong whatsoever. That was our pattern. That was what he anticipated from me. But I was exhausted of patterns that left me feeling diminished and insignificant. "Because you're my wife," he stated, his voice low and threatening in a manner that would have frightened me a year prior. "You're mine. You don't get to simply consent to attend dates with other men because you're upset about some foolish joke I made." There it was, finally. The truth behind all the humor and deflection finally exposed for me to observe. I was his property, his possession, something to be controlled and displayed according to his whims and desires. Not a partner, not an equal, an object he owned. "When did you cease seeing me as an individual?" I inquired quietly. The question seemed to catch him completely off guard. "When did I become merely your wife instead of Marlena? When did my thoughts and emotions and aspirations cease mattering to you at all? What are you discussing? Of course you matter to me." "Do I? Because for the past 8 years, you've made me feel like an inconvenience to your existence. Every occasion I succeed at work, you discover a method to diminish it, or make it about yourself instead. Every occasion I voice an opinion, you label me headstrong or challenging. Every occasion I attempt to have a discussion about our future, you charge me with being controlling. You've transformed every positive thing about me into a flaw that requires correction. And I've permitted you to do it, Sterling. I've permitted you to make me feel insignificant because I believed that's what marriage demanded. But it's not. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's merely gradual erosion of who I am as an individual." His complexion had become red with fury and something else I couldn't identify. "So what? You're going to attend this date this evening? Is that what this concerns? You desire to humiliate me even more than you already have? This isn't about humiliating you whatsoever. This concerns me finally advocating for myself after years of remaining silent. You made a decision yesterday when you chose to ridicule me before everyone. Now I'm making mine. If you depart through that door this evening, don't bother returning here," he declared, his voice cold as winter frost. I observed him for an extended moment. This man I had loved once. This man I had constructed a life with. And I sensed the final threads of hope snap and fall away like autumn leaves. "I've invested 8 years returning," I stated calmly. "Returning after every joke at my expense, every dismissive remark, every dispute where you made me feel like I was irrational for desiring more than what you were willing to provide. Perhaps it's time I ceased returning and commenced walking forward instead." I departed him sitting at that kitchen table with his cold coffee and proceeded upstairs to determine what I was going to wear. My hands were trembling as I opened the closet doors. But beneath the fear, something else was growing powerful. It felt like reclaiming a fragment of myself I had forgotten existed. At precisely 7:30 that evening, the doorbell chimed. I perceived Sterling's heavy footsteps cross the living room floor, heard the door open with a creak, and heard Callum's composed voice declare, "Good evening. I'm here to collect Marlena." I descended the stairs in a burgundy dress I hadn't worn in years, my hair cascading around my shoulders, my chin elevated high. Sterling stood in the doorway, obstructing Callum's entrance with his body, his fists clenched at his sides. But he didn't speak anything. He merely stepped aside and observed in silence, as I walked past him out the door and into the warm summer evening. As Callum opened the car door for me with a gentle smile, I glanced back at the residence one final time. Sterling stood on the porch, a silhouette against the illuminated windows, and for the initial time in our marriage, he was the one left wondering what came next. The car pulled away from the curb, and I observed our residence grow smaller in the side mirror until it vanished around the corner. My heart was racing. My palms were perspiring against the leather seat, but I didn't request Callum to turn around. I didn't apologize or explain or manufacture excuses for what I was doing. I merely sat there in the passenger seat as we traveled through the familiar streets of my neighborhood and permitted myself to imagine what it might feel like to be perceived as something more than someone's headstrong, excessively self-reliant wife. For the initial time in years, I permitted myself to imagine what it might feel like to be genuinely free. The restaurant Callum had selected was a tranquil French establishment called Lumiere on the historic district of Savannah. It was the variety of establishment with cream tablecloths and authentic silver candles flickering on every table, and a menu that didn't trouble listing prices because the clientele wasn't expected to concern themselves with such trivial matters. I hadn't visited somewhere this refined in years. Sterling always declared elegant restaurants were a waste of money we didn't possess, that we could dine just as satisfactorily at home for a fraction of the expense. Another subtle method he had controlled my existence without me even recognizing the cage was being constructed around me. Callum pulled out my chair for me as we were seated, a straightforward gesture of courtesy that Sterling had ceased doing after our initial anniversary. I experienced strangeness sitting there, almost like an imposter pretending to be someone who attended romantic dinners with attractive engineers. But as I settled into my seat and gazed across the candlelit table at Callum's warm smile, some of that strangeness commenced to dissolve. "I must be truthful with you," I declared, once the waiter had recorded our drink orders and glided away silently. "I'm not entirely certain why I'm present this evening." Callum nodded, his expression thoughtful and patient. "That's entirely reasonable. I imagine yesterday was rather overwhelming for you. That's one term for it." I smoothed the linen napkin in my lap, attempting to organize the chaos of my thoughts into something coherent. I've never done anything resembling this before in my existence. I've been married for 8 years. I've never even contemplated another man in that manner. And now I'm seated in a restaurant with our neighbor while my husband is probably wearing holes in the living room carpet. "Do you desire to return home?" Callum inquired. There was no judgment in his voice, no disappointment, merely genuine curiosity and concern for my well-being. I contemplated it carefully, turning the question over in my mind. I contemplated walking back into that residence on Willow Creek Lane, apologizing to Sterling the manner I always did, resuming the familiar pattern of diminishment and bitterness that had become our marriage throughout the years. The thought caused my stomach to turn with a dread so profound it surprised me. "No," I declared firmly. "I don't desire to return." Our drinks arrived in crystal glasses, and Callum reclined in his chair, studying me with those steady hazel eyes of his that seemed to perceive more than most individuals troubled to observe. "May I share something with you, Marlena?" "Certainly you may. I've observed you for 2 years now, not in a disturbing manner," he added quickly, and I couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. "But I noticed details about the world surrounding me. I'm an engineer by profession. It's what I do for a living. I observe structures, identify vulnerabilities, imagine how things could be reconstructed differently and better. I examine buildings, but I also examine people. And what have you observed about me?" He sampled his wine before responding, selecting his words with care. "I've observed a woman who carries herself like she's perpetually apologizing for occupying space in the world. I've witnessed you walk out to retrieve the mail in the morning, and even something that simple seems burdened by invisible weights. I've watched you smile at neighbors while your husband speaks over you, interrupt yourself mid-sentence when he provides you a certain expression, diminish yourself to fit into whatever shape he seems to require that particular day." I sensed tears prick unexpectedly at my eyes. No one had ever perceived me so clearly before. No one had ever troubled to observe that closely at who I genuinely was. "I've also witnessed you when you believe no one's observing," he continued gently. When you're tending your flowers on the front porch, or laughing at something on your phone, or walking home from work when you don't know anyone's watching you. That woman is different. She's confident. She's vibrant. She's the woman your husband seems absolutely determined to bury under criticism and ridicule. And why didn't you ever mention anything before now? Callum placed his glass carefully on the cream tablecloth. Because it wasn't my position to interfere in someone else's marriage. You were married. You appeared committed to making it function despite everything I witnessed. Who was I to say anything? But yesterday when he made that joke, when he stood there and offered you up like you were nothing more than an inconvenience he desired to be rid of, I couldn't remain quiet anymore. I understand what it feels like to be undervalued and dismissed by someone who's supposed to love you unconditionally, and I couldn't observe it happen to you anymore without at least offering you an alternative. The waiter appeared silently to record our dinner orders, and I was grateful for the interruption. It provided me a moment to compose myself, to process everything Callum was communicating and what it signified for me. When the waiter departed, I located my voice again. I don't know what occurs after this evening, I admitted. Honestly, I don't know if I'm prepared to leave my marriage. I don't know if I'm prepared for anything whatsoever. Honestly, everything feels like it's shifting beneath my feet, and I'm merely attempting not to fall. Callum reached across the table and gently touched my hand where it rested beside my bread plate. You don't have to understand anything presently. This evening doesn't have to concern decisions or plans or determining the entire future. It can merely be about two individuals sharing a meal and having a genuine conversation. Whatever you require it to be, that's precisely what it is. For the initial time in hours, I sensed my shoulders relax completely. The tension I had been carrying since the cookout commenced to release its hold on my muscles. Thank you, I declared quietly, for perceiving me, for speaking up when you didn't have to, for providing me the opportunity to remember what it feels like to be treated with fundamental human respect. Everyone deserves that, he declared simply. Especially you, Marlena. Over dinner, I learned about Callum's existence in ways I had never known before. Despite residing 4 houses apart for 2 years, he had grown up in Charleston, the son of a high school history instructor, and a pediatric nurse who worked shifts at the regional hospital. He had always loved constructing things, even as a young child, assembling elaborate models in his bedroom and dreaming of designing bridges that would span vast rivers someday. He had married young to his college sweetheart, but the relationship had concluded 6 years ago when she departed him for a partner at her accounting firm. That's when I relocated to Savannah, he explained, twirling his fork in his pasta. I required a fresh beginning in an entirely new location, a new city, new ventures at work, new existence entirely. It consumed considerable time before I ceased feeling like a failure for not being able to make my marriage function. But eventually I recognized that sometimes individuals merely grow in different directions. It doesn't signify anyone is damaged or worthless. It merely signifies the fit is incorrect. I contemplated his words as I twirled my own pasta on my fork. I don't believe Sterling and I grew in different directions, I declared slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. I believe we were always different individuals beneath the surface. I merely convinced myself that love would be sufficient to bridge the gap between us. And now, what do you believe? Now, I'm recognizing that love isn't supposed to feel like a constant negotiation, where I always lose. It's not supposed to require me to be less than I am, merely so someone else can feel more comfortable. I've been so afraid of being alone that I've been willing to be lonely inside my own marriage for years. Does that make any sense? Callum nodded, with profound understanding. It makes perfect sense to me. And for what it's worth, being alone is not the worst thing in the world. Sometimes it's the initial step toward discovering yourself again after you've been lost for so long. Our main courses arrived beautifully presented, and the conversation shifted to lighter subjects as we ate. He told me about the project he was currently working on, a pedestrian bridge in the historic district that would connect 2 neighborhoods previously separated by a busy thoroughfare. His eyes illuminated when he discussed engineering, about creating structures where people could travel and connect and improve their communities. I discovered myself genuinely interested in what he had to communicate, asking questions, sharing my own thoughts about design and infrastructure and what makes spaces feel welcoming rather than sterile. "You're easy to converse with," he declared at one point, looking almost surprised by his own observation. "So are you," I replied honestly. And I meant it completely. For years, conversation with Sterling had felt like navigating a minefield blindfolded. I never knew which subject would trigger his insecurity, which remark would be twisted into a dispute later, which observation would be used against me when he required ammunition. But with Callum, the words flowed naturally like water over smooth stones. He listened when I spoke, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was actually paying attention, seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on matters rather than waiting for his turn to talk. It was such a stark contrast to what I had grown accustomed to that I almost couldn't believe it was real. Around 9, as we were sharing a crème brûlée and debating the merits of different dessert wines with surprising passion, I glanced up to observe a familiar figure storming through the restaurant entrance like a thundercloud. My stomach dropped like a stone into deep water. Sterling's face was flushed in angry red, his eyes wild with a combination of alcohol and rage. He had clearly been drinking heavily since I departed. He scanned the dining room until he spotted us in the corner, and then he strode toward our table with a fury that caused other diners to turn and stare in alarm. "Are you serious right now?" he shouted as he approached, his voice far too loud for the refined atmosphere. "You're actually present with him?" Callum stood up calmly, positioning himself between Sterling and me with a deliberate movement. "Sterling, you're creating a scene. Let's relocate this outside where we can discuss privately. Don't instruct me what to do in my own city." Sterling snarled, his words slightly slurred. "That's my wife you're sitting with. My wife. Do you comprehend what that signifies?" "I comprehend that you publicly offered to exchange her less than 24 hours ago," Callum replied, his voice steady and controlled in a manner that seemed to infuriate Sterling further. "If you valued your wife so much, perhaps you should have demonstrated it before now." Sterling's face twisted with rage so intense it distorted his features. He gazed past Callum to where I sat frozen in my chair. "Stand up, Marlena. We're going home immediately." I sensed every eye in the restaurant fixed on our table. The hostess was already reaching for the phone at her station, probably to contact security or the police. I could sense the familiar pull of compliance tugging at me, the deeply ingrained urge to diffuse the situation, to minimize the damage, to apologize my way back to some semblance of peace. But then I observed Callum, standing there calmly between us, protecting me from a man who had never protected me from anything in our entire marriage. And I observed Sterling, red-faced and demanding, treating me like a possession to be reclaimed rather than a person to be respected. And I made my decision with clarity I had never experienced before. No. The word suspended in the atmosphere like a grenade with the pin removed, waiting to detonate. Sterling stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't process what I had just declared to him. "What did you just say to me?" I said. "No." I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, but my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going home with you, Sterling. Not this evening. Perhaps not ever again." His face contorted with fury so intense it frightened me even across the distance Callum maintained between us. "You can't do this to me. You can't merely walk out on 8 years of marriage because of some foolish joke I made." "It wasn't merely a joke," I declared, the words flowing freely now that the dam had finally broken. "It was the final in a very long line of jokes, of remarks, of put-downs and dismissals that have slowly convinced me that I'm not worth anything outside of what I provide for you. You've invested years making me feel insignificant and inadequate, and I've invested years permitting you to do it because I was afraid of precisely this moment. But I'm finished now. I'm finished diminishing myself to fit into your concept of what a wife should be. You're being dramatic and ridiculous," he scoffed loudly, playing to the audience of horrified diners around us. "Everyone experiences problems in their marriage. Every marriage has issues that require effort. You don't merely discard everything we constructed because you had a difficult day." "This isn't about one difficult day," I replied firmly. "This concerns 8 years of difficult days strung together. 8 years of feeling like a burden to my own husband. 8 years of watching you take everything I am and reduce it to a punchline for your entertainment. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who celebrates my independence instead of resenting it. Someone who encourages my aspirations instead of undermining them at every opportunity. Someone who perceives me as a partner, not a possession. By now, a manager in a dark suit had approached our table, flanked by a security guard who appeared like he could handle much worse than an intoxicated husband. "Sir, I'm going to have to request you to depart immediately," the manager declared firmly to Sterling. "You're disturbing our guests." Sterling glanced around wildly, seeming to finally notice the audience he had attracted with his outburst. Couples were whispering behind their menus. A family with young children was hurrying toward the exit. The entire restaurant had paused their meals to observe our drama unfold before them. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "You're all insane." But his bravado was fading rapidly. The public humiliation he had attempted to inflict on me was rebounding onto him instead. Callum stepped forward, still composed, but with an edge of steel in his voice that hadn't been present before. "I believe you should depart now, Sterling. Go home. Sleep it off. And when you awaken tomorrow, I hope you invest some time considering how you ended up here this evening. Because from where I'm standing, you're the one who destroyed your marriage, not Marlena." For a moment, I believed Sterling might swing at him. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white, his jaw set hard. But the security guard had positioned himself strategically nearby, and Sterling was just sober enough to recognize a losing battle when he witnessed one clearly. "This isn't concluded," he declared, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You're going to regret this decision for the remainder of your existence." Then he turned and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. The entrance door slammed behind him with a finality that echoed through the silent room. I sank back into my chair, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and emotion. Callum sat down across from me, his hand covering mine on the tablecloth reassuringly. "Are you all right?" I observed him. This man I barely knew who had just advocated for me in a manner no one ever had before in my entire existence. "I believe I will be," I declared slowly. "I believe for the initial time in a very long time. I'm actually going to be all right." The manager approached apologetically, offering to comp our entire meal and contact a car service. Callum handled everything efficiently, shielding me from having to make any additional decisions. I sat there in a daze, processing what had just occurred. I had declared no. I had refused to comply. I had advocated for myself before a room full of strangers, and the world hadn't concluded. Sterling had demonstrated everyone precisely who he was beneath his charming facade. And instead of being embarrassed for me, individuals were observing him with disgust and pity. This was the clarity I had been awaiting without even knowing it. All the doubt, all the guilt, all the second-guessing that had kept me trapped for so long. It all evaporated in the face of Sterling's public meltdown. He had made our private dysfunction visible for everyone to witness, and in doing so, he had freed me from the prison of pretending everything was fine. Callum drove me home through the quiet Savannah streets, the city lights blurring past my window. We didn't communicate much during the journey. He seemed to comprehend that I required space to process, and I was grateful for his silence and patience. When we pulled up before my residence on Willow Creek Lane, I noticed that all the lights were illuminated inside. Sterling was home, probably waiting to continue our dispute. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during the restaurant confrontation. I wasn't afraid anymore. "Thank you," I declared to Callum sincerely, "for dinner this evening, for advocating for me, for everything." He smiled softly at me. "You don't have to thank me for treating you with basic respect. But you're welcome. What occurs now?" I asked the question directed at myself as much as at him. "Now you proceed inside and take care of yourself this evening and tomorrow. If you desire to communicate, I'm merely 4 houses down the street." He paused, then added, "Whatever you decide about your marriage, about your existence, merely understand that you deserve to be happy. You deserve to be with someone who elevates you instead of tearing you down constantly. Don't permit anyone to convince you otherwise." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Then I opened the car door and walked up the stone path to my entrance door, prepared to face whatever came next. As I placed my key in the lock, I perceived Callum's car pull away behind me. I drew a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped inside to face the remainder of my existence. The confrontation that evening was brutal, but surprisingly brief. Sterling was waiting in the living room, the remains of a six-pack scattered across the coffee table like evidence of his evening. He launched into a tirade the moment I walked through the door. Accusations and insults flying like shrapnel in every direction. I permitted him to rant without interruption. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't explain. I simply listened, observing him exhaust himself against the wall of my silence. When he finally ran out of energy, slumped on the couch with his head in his hands, I spoke the words I should have spoken years ago. I desire a divorce. The silence that followed felt like oxygen filling a room that had been locked shut for 8 long years. Sterling lifted his head slowly, his expression moving through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally something that appeared almost like fear. "You don't mean that." "I do mean it." I sat down in the chair across from him, folding my hands in my lap calmly. "This marriage has been dying for years, Sterling. We've been going through the motions, pretending everything is fine while we slowly destroy each other. I can't do it anymore. I won't do it anymore." Because of him? Because of one date with our neighbor? No, because of me. Because I finally remembered who I was before I commenced disappearing into this marriage. Because I invested 8 years believing that your love was conditional on me being smaller, quieter, less ambitious than I genuinely am. And because yesterday, when you stood before everyone and offered to exchange me, you demonstrated me exactly how little you value what we have. He was quiet for an extended moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost pleading. "We can work on this together. We can attend counseling. I can change." "You've declared that before," I reminded him gently. "After the occasion you mocked my advancement at your office party. After you convinced me to decline that job opportunity. After every dispute where I begged you to perceive things from my perspective. Every occasion you promised to change. And every occasion things went directly back to the manner they were. It'll be different this time around. Perhaps it would be, but I don't possess the capacity to find out." I stood up slowly, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room this evening. Tomorrow I'll commence searching for an apartment. I'll have my attorney contact you about the details." He stared at me, as if perceiving me for the initial time. "You've already thought this through." "I've been contemplating it for years," I admitted honestly. "I merely required something to finally push me over the edge. You provided me that yesterday. In a twisted manner, I should probably thank you." I departed him sitting there in the wreckage of our marriage and climbed the stairs to the guest room. That evening, for the initial time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I awoke the following morning, I sensed lighter than I had in years. The following weeks were a blur of logistics and emotions. I located an apartment in the Victorian district, a cozy one-bedroom with large windows and a small balcony where I could grow herbs in the sunshine. I hired an attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria, who specialized in divorce proceedings and tolerated no nonsense from anyone. I commenced the slow process of untangling my existence from Sterling's, dividing assets and memories with clinical precision. Sterling fought the divorce initially, refusing to believe it was genuinely happening. But as the weeks transformed into months, even he had to accept reality. Our marriage was concluded. My sister Primrose was my foundation through it all. She assisted me in moving into my new apartment, bringing boxes and wine and a willingness to listen whenever I required processing. She never declared, "I told you so," though she had every right to after all those years of holding her tongue. "I'm proud of you," she told me one evening, as we sat on my new balcony observing the sunset paint the Savannah skyline gold and orange. "I understand this hasn't been simple, but you're managing it with so much grace." "I don't always feel graceful," I admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm falling apart completely." "That's acceptable too," she declared warmly. "Falling apart is sometimes the initial step toward putting yourself back together in a better manner." As I settled into my new existence, I commenced rediscovering parts of myself I had buried during my marriage. I commenced waking up early to run along the riverfront, something I had loved in college but had ceased doing after Sterling complained about the early morning noise. I signed up for a watercolor class on weekends, getting my hands dirty with paint and creating imperfect, beautiful things. I accepted that advancement at work I had been hesitating about, no longer worried about overshadowing anyone. The Marlena who emerged from the divorce was stronger, more confident, and more herself than she had been in years. I didn't recognize her initially. She was a stranger who gazed back at me from the mirror with clear eyes and a steady gaze. But over time, I commenced remembering her. This was who I had been before Sterling. This was who I could be again. Callum and I maintained contact throughout those months. He would text occasionally, checking in, inquiring how I was doing. We went for coffee a few occasions, walks in the park, low-key encounters that felt like friendship slowly evolving into something more. I wasn't prepared for a relationship, and he comprehended that completely. He never pressured, never pushed. He simply appeared consistently and kindly, proving through his actions that not all men perceived my independence as a threat. Approximately 3 months after my divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my apartment on a Friday evening, consuming dinner alone, and feeling perfectly content about it when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to discover Callum standing there holding a paper bag from my favorite Vietnamese restaurant down the street. "I thought you might desire some companionship this evening," he declared, a bit sheepish. "And some pho." I laughed and stepped aside to permit him entrance. We ate on my couch observing a documentary about architecture that he had been wanting to show me, and discussed everything and nothing. It was effortless, comfortable, without any of the landmines I had grown accustomed to navigating. "May I inquire something?" he declared as the documentary credits rolled. "Certainly you may. That evening at the cookout, when I asked what hour I could collect you, I fully anticipated you to decline, or to laugh it off, or to devise some excuse. When you declared 7:30 and merely walked away, I believe I ceased breathing for approximately a minute." I smiled, remembering that moment clearly. I surprised myself too. I believe something merely snapped inside me. Years of suppressing my emotions, of accepting treatment I never should have accepted. It all came to a head in that moment. Your offer provided me an exit I didn't realize I was searching for. "I'm glad," he declared simply. "Not that your marriage was problematic. That causes me sadness, honestly. But I'm glad you discovered your way out of it. And I'm glad I got to be a small part of that." I reached over and took his hand gently. "You were more than a small part. You demonstrated me what respect appears like in action. You reminded me that I deserve to be valued. That matters more than you realize." He squeezed my hand softly. "For what it's worth, I've never perceived you as the woman your husband described. I've only ever witnessed a woman who was too vibrant to be contained by someone else's limitations, someone who deserved to be celebrated, not diminished." We sat there in comfortable silence, the Savannah evening glowing through my windows. I didn't know what the future held for us, whether this friendship would grow into something more, or remain precisely what it was. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had chosen myself. And that decision had led me here to this moment of peace and possibility. 6 months after the divorce, I received news about Sterling through the neighborhood grapevine. Primrose's husband had learned it from someone who worked with him at the company. After our separation became public knowledge, Sterling's reputation had taken a significant hit. The story of the cookout had spread, as stories do in close-knit communities, and individuals commenced observing him differently. The charming account manager persona he had cultivated for years commenced to crumble as more and more individuals recognized there was something ugly beneath the surface. He had been passed over for an advancement at work, losing out to a younger colleague he had always dismissed as inferior. His performance numbers dropped dramatically as clients detected his increasingly bitter and hostile attitude. Finally, approximately 5 months after our divorce, he was requested to depart Meridian Industries entirely. The company cited performance issues, but everyone knew the genuine reason. He had become toxic to work with, and no one desired to be around him anymore. I also learned that he had attempted to commence dating again with predictably disastrous results. Word had gotten around about how he treated his wife, and the eligible women in his social circle desired nothing to do with him. He was apparently investing most of his evenings alone in the residence we used to share, which he could barely afford to maintain on a single income. Now, the irony of him ending up isolated and lonely after years of making me experience that manner inside our marriage was not lost on me. I didn't experience satisfaction hearing this news. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. Mostly, I merely felt sad. Sad that it had required public humiliation and professional consequences for Sterling to face the truth about himself. Sad that he might never actually learn the lessons existence was attempting to teach him. Sad that I had wasted 8 years on a man who was never capable of perceiving me clearly. But I also felt free. Whatever occurred to Sterling now was his journey, not mine. I had done my part by finally walking away. As for Callum, things between us continued to develop slowly and naturally. By the 1-year anniversary of that fateful cookout, we were officially together. He never rushed me, never attempted to define what we were before I was prepared. He simply remained present, patient, and kind, proving every day that partnership could be a source of strength rather than diminishment. One summer evening, we found ourselves at my sister's residence again. Another cookout, another gathering of family and friends. As I stood by the picnic table observing Callum joke with Primrose's husband and assist flipping burgers on the grill, I sensed someone approach beside me. "You appear happy," Primrose declared, handing me a glass of lemonade. "I am happy," I declared, and meant it completely. "That gentleman over there," she declared, nodding toward Callum. "He observes you like you hung the moon. He makes me feel like I did." Primrose smiled warmly. "That's how it's supposed to be." I contemplated the journey that had brought me here, the years of diminishing myself, the joke that had finally broken something loose inside me, the terror and exhilaration of accepting that date, the confrontation at the restaurant, the divorce, the rebuilding. All of it had led to this moment. Standing in my sister's backyard with the summer sun warm on my face and a future full of possibility stretching out before me, Callum caught my eye across the yard and smiled. That warm, genuine smile that still caused my heart to skip. I smiled back at him. I had learned something important over the past year. Accepting that date had never genuinely been about Callum at all. It had been about me, about finally choosing myself after years of choosing someone else's comfort over my own well-being, about remembering that I was worthy of respect, of kindness, of love that didn't arrive with conditions and fine print attached. Sterling's downfall had been entirely of his own making, his cruelty, his need to diminish others to feel significant himself, his inability to value what he possessed until it was gone forever. He was still struggling to rebuild his existence, still alone in that empty residence, still facing the consequences of treating individuals like possessions rather than partners. Meanwhile, I had constructed something new and beautiful from the ashes of what he destroyed. The revenge, if you could call it that, was simply living well. Sterling had attempted to diminish me, to exchange me like I was nothing, and instead, I had used that moment to reclaim everything he had taken from me. My confidence, my ambition, my sense of self-worth, my belief that I deserved happiness and love. Looking back on everything now, I recognize that accepting that date at 7:30 had been the initial step toward the existence I was always meant to live. It wasn't about revenge or proving him wrong. It was about finally stepping toward the individual I was always supposed to become, and I had never once looked back since.